scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa loved playing hide and seek with George, but today the game felt different. When she counted to 10 and opened her eyes, George was nowhere to be found. She looked in all his usual hiding spots behind the sofa, under the kitchen table, in the toy box, but he had simply vanished. Mummy Pig was in the kitchen making lunch, humming a cheerful tune. When Peppa asked where George was, Mummy Pig just smiled and said he was playing upstairs. But when Peppa went to check, George's room was empty. His bed was perfectly made, and his favorite dinosaur toy was sitting exactly in the center, staring at the door with its plastic eyes. Peppa called out for George throughout the house, but only her own voice echoed back. The strange thing was, sometimes the echo sounded different, younger, like George's voice, but saying words he had never learned to say. The echoes seemed to come from inside the walls themselves, as if George was trapped somewhere she couldn't see. Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper in the living room, but when Peppa asked him about George, he just pointed upstairs without looking up from his paper. The newspaper rustled strangely, and Peppa noticed that all the words on the pages were the same word repeated over and over. George, George, George. As evening approached, the family sat down for dinner. There were still 4 plates on the table, including George's favorite blue one. Mummy and Daddy Pig talked about George as if he was sitting right there, asking him to eat his vegetables and praising him for being such a good boy. They even laughed at things he supposedly said, though his chair remained empty. Peppa began to wonder if George had ever existed at all, or if she had imagined having a little brother. But then she found his drawings scattered around the house, pictures of dinosaurs and family stick figures. In every drawing, there were 3 pigs and 1 empty space where a 4th pig should have been, as if George had been drawing his own absence. That night, as Peppa lay in bed, she heard George's voice coming from his empty room next door. He was talking to someone, having a conversation in his usual simple words. But when she crept to his doorway to listen, the room was still empty, and the voice was coming from nowhere at all. Peppa realized that George might be playing the longest game of hide and seek ever, hiding so well that even he had forgotten where he was. She whispered into the darkness, promising that if he came back, she would let him win every game they ever played. But the only answer was the sound of her own voice, echoing back from somewhere far away, sounding smaller and younger than before. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary morning in Peppa's house, or so it seemed. The sun was shining through the green walls of the living room, casting familiar shadows across the orange sofa. Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The air was thicker, heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath. When Peppa went downstairs for breakfast, she found her family sitting around the kitchen table in complete silence. Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, and little George were all there, but their eyes were staring straight ahead, unblinking. Their smiles were frozen in place, too wide, too perfect. Peppa called out to them, but they didn't respond. They just kept staring with those unnaturally bright eyes. The television in the living room flickered on by itself, showing static that slowly formed into shapes. Peppa could see herself on the screen, but this version was different. Her reflection moved independently, waving at her with movements that didn't match her own. The reflection's smile grew wider and wider until it stretched beyond what should be possible. Peppa tried to turn off the television, but the remote wouldn't work. Every channel showed the same thing, her own face, but wrong somehow. The reflection began to speak, but the words came out backwards, like a recording played in reverse. The sound filled the entire house, echoing from every room. When Peppa looked back at her family, they had all turned to face her. Their frozen smiles were still there, but now their heads moved in perfect unison, following her every step. George's favorite dinosaur toy sat on the table, but its plastic eyes seemed to blink when no one was looking directly at it. Peppa ran upstairs to her bedroom, hoping to escape the strange atmosphere. But when she looked in her bedroom mirror, she saw the same wrong reflection from the television. This other Peppa pressed her hands against the glass from the inside, as if trying to break through. The real Peppa stepped closer, and their hands almost touched through the mirror's surface. Suddenly, everything went quiet, The house felt normal again. Peppa could hear her family laughing downstairs, calling her name for breakfast. But when she looked in the mirror one last time, she saw her reflection wink at her with one eye, while she herself had not moved at all. As Peppa walked back downstairs, she wondered if she was really the one walking, or if she was the one trapped behind the glass, watching someone else live her life. The laughter from the kitchen sounded just a little too perfect, just a little too bright, like everything else in this house that felt almost, but not quite, like home.
Peppa Pig, the mask. It began on a cold, windy day, the kind of wind that pulled at trees and scattered wet leaves across the pavement. The sky had been gray for many days, the park was empty, and the paths were soggy. Peppa and George were walking along a muddy path. Leaves stuck to their boots, and the ground squelched beneath them. Then Peppa saw a white shape lying in the grass. A mask. It lay perfectly flat, as if placed there on purpose. Not fallen, not forgotten. Face up, white, smooth, featureless. Just two dark slits for eyes, and a thin line where a mouth should be, not a smile. Peppa stopped. She bent down, touched it with her hoof. The mask was dry, not cold, as if it had been waiting for her. She pressed it to her face. The mask stuck, silently, effortlessly. At first it seemed like a game, but the mask wouldn't come off. Her hooves slid along the surface, finding no edge, no straps, no seams, nothing. She tugged, pulled harder. It didn't move. The mask had become part of her face. When they returned home, no one reacted, or maybe no one wanted to. The family acted as though nothing had changed, too calm, too quiet. Peppa sat at the dinner table, but her voice sounded muffled, like it was coming through glass. No one looked directly at her. The next day, the mirror behaved oddly. When Peppa turned her head, the reflection lagged behind. When she raised her hoof, the motion was off, as if someone inside the mirror was trying to mimic her but not quite managing. By the third day, she could barely feel her face. The mask didn't press, didn't itch. It simply was, still, silent. She tried to remember her old appearance, but the image blurred, like looking through foggy water. Her toys felt unfamiliar. The room looked wrong. Even her favorite blanket smelled different. Her clothes didn't fit right. Everything rubbed, tugged, shifted. She no longer felt at home in her own home. Time passed strangely, day after day, but it meant nothing. The house grew quieter, as if it were absorbing sound. Mummy and Daddy rarely spoke. They were present but distant and fading. Peppa began to hear whispering, not from outside, from within. A whisper without breath, without tone, repeating again and again, "You are the mask. You are me. You were." On the fourth day, the photographs changed. Faces faded. First George, then Daddy, then Peppa herself. The places where eyes and smiles used to be became pale, empty spots. Sometimes the mask itself changed, subtly, narrower, smoother, as if it was adjusting. Each time she looked in the mirror, she saw something unfamiliar, something staring back at her from the shadows, always silent. On the fifth day, the room had changed. No windows, walls blank like paper. The air was heavy, like she'd slept for too long. She woke up and didn't recognize anything. Nothing felt familiar, no toys, no books, no sound. In the middle of the floor lay the mask, dry, clean, and no longer on her. She couldn't remember who she was, didn't know why she stood up, didn't feel her own face. In the mirror across the room stood something that resembled Peppa, but the eyes were hollow, and inside them, silence. Peppa was gone. Only the shell remained, only the mask remained, waiting for a new face, a new game. Since then, some days, along the damp paths near the park, the mask can be seen again, lying neatly, dry, clean, and if anyone picks it up, they may hear a soft whisper from within.
Peppa Pig, the box of drawings. It started on a quiet morning. Peppa woke up to a rustling sound. George was dragging something along the floor. In the hallway, she saw him carrying a cardboard box. Old, dusty, no writing on it. It looked like something forgotten in a basement. "Where did you get that?" Peppa asked. George didn't answer. He just smiled. He placed the box on the floor and opened it. Inside were drawings, dozens, some on torn scraps of paper, others fresh and colorful, all drawn by a child's hoof. Did you draw these? George stayed silent. The first drawing was simple. Peppa standing in the kitchen, a broken cup on the floor, Daddy with a broom, Mummy holding a rag. A few hours later, it happened, exactly like in the drawing, down to the smallest detail. Peppa dropped a cup, shards scattered. Daddy sighed. Mummy got the rag. Just a coincidence, Mummy said. But George pulled out the next drawing. It showed their garden, a ball stuck in the tree, Daddy holding a ladder, Peppa reaching up. The next day the ball really did get stuck, in the same place, exactly like the drawing. Peppa started going through the drawings. The further she went, the darker they became. The colors, duller. The figures, twisted. One showed Peppa's room at night. At the window, a silhouette. Faceless. Peppa shoved it to the bottom of the box. But that night she woke up, went to the window. For a moment, she thought someone had just stepped out of view. Another drawing, the bathroom, the mirror, Peppa's reflection smiling, even though she wasn't. Another one, George sleeping, and beside his bed stood a second George, identical, but with red crayon eyes. Peppa hid the box in the closet, but George found it again. He said, "I have to keep watching." Every day, new drawings appeared, even though no one was drawing. One morning, at the very top of the pile, was a picture of that exact breakfast. The tablecloth, the cup, the toast, all correct. At the edge, a drop. Peppa thought it was paint, but it was tea. Then came a drawing of the living room. Daddy asleep in his chair, and behind him, someone reaching toward his shoulder. That evening, Daddy flinched. He said, "I thought someone touched me." But the room was empty. At last, Peppa found the final drawing. It was black and white. It showed herself, standing alone in an empty room. No windows, no toys. Her face, blank. Arms limp at her sides, and behind her, the box, and written in neat handwriting, "Now you're inside." That night, Peppa woke up. The room felt unusually dark, too quiet. On the floor, the box, empty. All the drawings were gone. Only one remained. It lay on top. It showed Mummy, Daddy, and George sitting at the table, smiling, laughing. But Peppa wasn't there, and at the bottom, written carefully, "They don't remember you anymore."
A scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The familiar yellow walls seemed darker somehow, and the cheerful pictures on the wall appeared to be watching her with their painted eyes. Peppa rubbed her eyes and looked again, but everything seemed normal now. Downstairs, Mummy and Daddy Pig were having breakfast as usual, but they weren't talking. They sat in complete silence, their eyes fixed straight ahead, chewing their food with mechanical precision. When Peppa said good morning, they turned their heads toward her in perfect unison, their smiles too wide, their eyes too bright. George was playing with his toy dinosaur in the corner, but the toy wasn't making its usual roaring sounds. Instead, it seemed to whisper something that Peppa couldn't quite understand. When she moved closer to listen, George looked up at her with eyes that weren't quite his own. They were darker, older, as if something else was looking out from behind them. The telephone rang, and Mummy Pig answered it with that same unnaturally wide smile. She spoke in a voice that sounded like hers, but felt wrong, agreeing to meet someone at the playground. As they prepared to leave the house, Peppa noticed that all the clocks had stopped at exactly 12 minutes past 3. At the playground, all of Peppa's friends were already there, standing in a perfect circle around the slide. Susie Sheep, Pedro Pony, Rebecca Rabbit, and all the others stood motionless, their heads tilted at the same angle, their smiles identical. They began to speak in unison, their voices creating a strange harmony that made Peppa's ears ring. The playground equipment began to move on its own. The swings swayed back and forth with no one on them, the seesaw rocked up and down in a steady rhythm, and the roundabout spun slowly, creaking with each turn. The children continued to stand in their circle, their eyes never blinking. Peppa tried to run, but her legs felt heavy, as if she was moving through thick mud. Behind her, she could hear the sound of footsteps, all perfectly synchronized, following her at the same steady pace. No matter how hard she tried to run faster, the footsteps stayed exactly the same distance behind her. She found herself back at home, but it wasn't quite right. The yellow house was now a pale gray color, and the windows were all dark, even though she could see lights moving inside them. The front door opened before she could reach it, and Daddy Pig stood there with his arms outstretched, welcoming her home with that same too-wide smile. Inside, the family sat around the dinner table, but there was no food. They all stared at Peppa as she entered, their heads turning to follow her movement. The silence was broken only by the sound of the grandfather clock in the hallway, ticking much too loudly. As night fell, Peppa lay in her bed, listening to the sounds of the house, but instead of the familiar creaks, she heard whispers coming from the walls themselves. The voices were soft and constant, speaking in a language she didn't understand, but somehow felt she should. By the end of the week, Peppa stood with her family and friends in the same perfect formation, her head tilted at the same angle as theirs, her smile identical to all the others. The whispers had become a comforting lullaby, and everything was exactly as it should be.
Peppa Pig, Red Sky. One morning, Peppa woke up without knowing what had disturbed her. The alarm hadn't rung, no one had called her, but something felt wrong. She sat up in bed. Her room was flooded with light, but it wasn't warm or golden. It was dark red, heavy, like the glow of a lamp hidden behind thick fabric, as if the entire world beyond the window had changed. Peppa walked toward the curtain, reached out, but stopped. On the floor just in front of the window lay a crumpled note, its corners bent, the paper creased as if someone had thrown it long ago and it had been waiting ever since, scrawled in uneven handwriting, "Don't look out the window," written hastily, the letters trembling. Peppa turned around. Everything in the room was as usual, same toys, same bedspread, but it all seemed just a little darker, as if the world had been shifted half a step to the side. She stepped into the hallway. The walls looked grayish. The air smelled like dust. Downstairs, Mummy and Daddy were sitting at the table, silent. Daddy held a newspaper but wasn't reading. Mummy stared into her cup as if looking down a deep well. "Good morning," Peppa said. No answer. "What's wrong with the sky? Why is everything so red?" Mummy lifted her head, slowly. Her smile was almost normal, but her eyes didn't move, as if she had forgotten how. "And where's George?" Still silence. A slight creak from Daddy's chair. He didn't move. Peppa ran upstairs. George's bed was perfectly made, pillow smoothed, blanket tucked. On the sheet, another note. He looked. Just 2 words. But she understood. The bedroom window was sealed from the inside, dark grey tape, crisscrossed. Behind the glass, the red light pressed in. Thick and still, like a fog inside a windowless room, it didn't flicker, it didn't move. It just existed, and it felt alive. Peppa peeked into the hallway again. The red light had grown stronger, but gave off no warmth. It didn't illuminate, it swallowed whatever it touched. She went back to the kitchen. Her parents were frozen. Mummy's spoon trembled at the edge of her cup, but her hand was locked in place. "Why aren't you talking?" Peppa asked. No reply. On the far wall, a crack appeared, barely visible at first, then slowly growing, as if something behind the wall was scratching from the inside, deliberate, steady. A faint hiss spread across the floorboards. That evening, the house fell deeper into silence. Even the clocks had stopped. Mummy didn't blink. Daddy didn't breathe, yet his chest continued to rise and fall, like someone pretending to be alive. Peppa sat in her room. On the floor, a new note. "Don't open your eyes." She squeezed them shut, tight, but still, she could see the red glow through her eyelids. Footsteps, soft hooves, moving slowly through the hallway. Carefully, they stopped at her door. "Peppa," whispered a voice, childlike, a little like George's, but hollow inside. "You want to look, don't you?" She kept her eyes closed. The next morning never came. The light remained the same. Red, constant. No Mummy, no Daddy, no George. The house was empty. Only the faint rustling in the corners and the echo of her own footsteps remained. On the kitchen table sat one final note. Now you're alone. Don't look up. Ever. She lasted one day, then another. Then she lost track. One day, Peppa stood up, walked to the window, slowly peeled off the tape, strip by strip. Behind the glass, not a street, not the sky, something red, vast, shapeless, and within it, an eye, enormous, alive, unlike anything she'd ever seen. It stared straight at her, and Peppa couldn't look away. The eye was too close, too bright, too... correct. She's no longer visible in the house, but if you stand quietly in front of the window long enough, you might catch a reflection, small, childlike, with eyes wide open, eyes that never blink again.